The story of Berlin is that of division and defiance, a city split not only by concrete walls, but more profoundly by the ideological divide that severed the age. It then became the nerve center for battle sieges and bombs to be unleashed within the junction of ideologies as communities and families are torn apart by an ardent heave for a strong political conviction. Yet Berlin, even at its weakest point, lives at the center of resilience and hope embodied by the human spirit. However, the walls in Berlin were not the battlefields of the Cold War. Well beyond the city's fractured streets, battles were being carried out on many continents and turning into proxy wars that would hurt distant nations in the geography away from Berlin. As these foreign lands became battlefields where these divisions became intensified, it has emerged that probably these fights were not needed. Were these conflicts predestined to occur, or perhaps should the divisions never have occurred? As deep as the scars were in Berlin, so were the wounds of the proxy wars. The weight of superpower ambitions lay on Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Angola, as the people fought against what they had never wished for. A divided world may heal, but how does a world divide when battle lines have crossed borders and continents? Were the wounds of the proxy wars repairable, or were the cracks left to mark them forever? It would eventually go down in history as one of the most defining conflicts of the Cold War, a symbolic struggle for ideological supremacy between communism and capitalism. Right after the First Indochina War in 1954, the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel. Communist North, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, sought to reunify it under communist rule, whereas South, aided by the Western world, preferred a non-communist government with Ngo Dinh Diem as the head of the administration. As tensions increased, so did the American involvement, fueled by the domino theory, the idea that if one fell to communism, others would automatically follow. Small-scale military advisor missions soon grew into large deployments of American troops in the 1960s, then into full-bore bombing operations and ground operations. Though having way better military technology, the United States was unable to break free of the North Vietnamese Army, NVA forces, and those from the Viet Cong, which in turn adapted some of their styles of old-time guerrilla warfare towards the extreme, dense jungles to further take advantage of. The North side was militarily and financially supported by the Soviet Union and China, effectively making Vietnam a proxy battlefield of superpowers in the Cold War. The use of external aid strengthened North Vietnam and prolonged the war. The war came to a close with the fall of Saigon in 1975 as a culmination when U.S. involvement ended, and Vietnam united under communist rule. The war left deep scars. Millions of Vietnamese lost their lives, lands were razed, and generations were uprooted. For the United States, the war left deep divisions, broke the public, and disillusioned veterans. The role of a global policeman was no longer easy to justify. The Vietnam War is a somber lesson in the need to understand the complexities and costs of ideological conflicts. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to shore up its ailing communist government from the most consequential proxy wars of the Cold War. Indeed, the chessboard politics of the period created Afghanistan to be one of the critical battlefields, and the Soviets would not let it collapse into either a Western or Islamist state. The invasion was supposed to stabilize the unpopular policies and repressive policies of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, which had caused widespread rebellion in the land. The Soviets, however, underrated the fiercest resistance. The United States, wanting to counter Soviet expansion, responded with covert operations through the CIA. Under Operation Cyclone, the U.S. channeled billions of dollars in arms and aid to the Mujahideen Afghan resistance fighters. This support, with which there was added advanced weaponry like Stinger missiles, made Afghanistan a quagmire for the Soviets. Regional players like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia played important roles in supporting the Mujahideen, and therefore the affair became international. The Soviet Union suffered disastrous losses during this war. It drained its economy, overstretched its military, and undermined public morale to support a communist regime in its homeland. In many ways, the war drew to a close as a contributor to weakening Soviet control by the end of the 1980s and forced it to pull out of Afghanistan in 1989. Conflicts to come had made Afghanistan a hotspot with far-reaching implications due to the Cold War. For the Soviet Union, it was one of its Vietnam War dearly bought interventions, showing the limits of superpower hegemony and hastening the end of the Cold War. It then became the scene of Cold War conflict following independence from Portugal in 1975. Unity and instead went straight into civil war, fed on ideological cleavage and external manipulation. It divided into two strong factions, on each side of which other world powers had camped their stand: MPLA, on whose side the Soviets camped its ground, and the UNITA, which Americans also supported. The MPLA, with the Soviet Union and Cuba providing strong military and financial support, aimed to establish a socialist state. The United States, eager to counter Soviet influence in Africa, allied with UNITA, providing weapons, training, and funding. South Africa also intervened on the side of UNITA, further escalating the violence. This Cold War proxy war turned Angola into a battleground for the competing ideologies of communism and capitalism. It left the country crippled. The long decades of the conflict resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives and forced millions to be displaced. Its infrastructure crumbled and its economy was stagnant as the war consumed the resources of Angola. Foreign powers saw Angola as a strategic pawn, but for the people, the war brought nothing but suffering and destruction. The Angolan Civil War was a stark example of how Cold War rivalries used regional conflicts as opportunities to inflame rather than settle those conflicts. Decades of turmoil and struggle following Angolan independence would mark that young nation, leaving its indelible imprint. The repeated themes and approaches of Cold War proxy wars frame this conflict as the expression of the Cold War itself between the United States and the Soviet Union, as these superpowers continued to fight by proxy, fueling other regional and civil conflicts throughout the world. Every conflict was not just a simple regional dispute, but it came to be painted as a field for freedom or socialism. For the United States, intervention in Vietnam or Afghanistan was to protect democracy and stop the domino effect of communism. The Soviet Union, however, defended its intervention in Angola and Afghanistan as an act of solidarity with oppressed peoples fighting imperialism. Both superpowers funneled vast economic and military resources into these wars. The United States, for example, supplied billions in weapons and aid to anti-communist forces like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan or UNITA in Angola. The Soviet Union, in turn, supported Marxist governments with arms, training, and sometimes direct military intervention, as in Afghanistan. Propaganda was a significant aspect. Both superpowers used mass media to create public support by describing their involvement respectively as morally justifiable and strategically necessary. To the United States, this was presented in rhetoric against communism. To the Soviet Union, international socialism was given prominence. These tactics changed the regional conflicts to ideological battlegrounds where wars have been prolonged and destruction has been widened. Proxy wars have shown how the Cold War superpowers manipulated tension in the globe for their utmost interests. This incident has, therefore, made a tremendous humankind and an economic cost. They illustrated the dangers of ideological extremism, where the well-being of nations they exploited mattered less than global agendas for the superpowers involved. External interventions, masquerading under the rhetoric of liberation or defense, are followed to further entangle conflicts, prolong suffering, and destabilize total regions. These wars rarely represented the people on the ground, but rather constituted chess games played by distant powers, devastating their consequences. These modern antagonisms echo the shadows of Cold War proxy wars. They fund, arm, or fight through proxies in countries in the Middle East or elsewhere, create humanitarian crises, and reinforce cycles of violence. The lessons of Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Angola, where foreign involvement only deepened divisions, serve as a stark reminder of the costs of such interference. The scars of the proxy wars can still be seen in Afghanistan and Angola. It's the same generation, but the same economic fractures it goes through with such wars. It's the same story for social divisions created or accentuated in such conflicts, as those are always tough to mend and leave behind lots of unfinished business that chokes progress. Therefore, the legacies of such wars remind us to learn lessons for being more cautious. Ideological obsessions tell a cautionary story as they bring a reminder of how most things could be solved in case there is pressure for diplomacy and peace building instead of war. The Cold War has been over, but the proxy wars that define its political landscape remain as lessons urging us to learn from mistakes in history. The silent battleground of the Cold War was through proxy wars. The superpowers warred not necessarily facing each other, but in others' lives. From Vietnam to Afghanistan and Angola, these wars unfolded how far states would go for ideological supremacy, often at the cost of millions of lives lost and lasting stability. They offered the stiff price of idealistic fervor, where globalization ambition clashed with home realities, breaking nations apart and leaving behind generations war-scarred. What made a nation rise to such heights? Was it actually for freedom and socialism, or merely a veneer for a new battle for hegemony in global affairs? How far can such an ideological fight go? And when the battlegrounds were no longer distant lands but the very future of humanity itself, what choices would the world face?